All right, Shabbos, say good morning, or good tavach. Hope that everybody had a beautiful, uplifting, and holy Shabbos. Such a zechus, Baruch Hashem, to be able to begin the week together. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors. So thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Adar Beis, the Schwarzbaum Family, in memory of Rabbi Aaron Schwarzbaum, Aharon Yosef ben Meir, Zechron Lebracha, Leah Sol, and the zechus of her daughter Ilana bas Esther's successful surgery, complete refuah, safe return of all of our hostages, and hatzlacha for our soldiers. Maia Hoffman, memory of her father, Reuven ben Emanuel, zechron lebracha, and in the merit of hatzlacha, health, and joy for her entire mishpacha. Yoel Sara Kelman, in honor of the birth of their son, and in memory of Staff Sergeant David Sasson, Hashem Yikom Damo, age 21, who was killed fighting in Gaza on March 6th, 2024. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, all of the neshama have an aliyah, the family neshama, all of those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. Each and every one of our hostages should come home b'shalom and b'karov, and their soldiers in Meir Hashem should have success b'chol ma'asei yedechem. But with that, let us begin an incredible daf out of us today. It's actually always exciting. Today's daf is Lamed Beis 32 Leiv. I always think like whenever you get to the leiv daf of any mesechta, so maybe if we try a little bit harder, then in Meir Hashem, hopefully we'll be able to discover something. I don't know, something in the neshama of Bava Metzia that in Meir Hashem speaks to our neshamas as well. So in Meir Hashem, we find treasure every single day. We're like the treasure hunters of daf. In Meir Hashem, we'll find buried treasure today in the leiv of Bava Metzia as well. So I'll say, with that, let us begin. We are picking up Lamed Aleph Amud Beis 31b. We left off yesterday. We actually covered good ground, Baruch Hashem. I mean, we missed this man for mincha, but whatever, But we covered good ground, Baruch Hashem. Oh no, we did. We got mincha. Just we have to be a little chassidish in our zmanim. All right, so we are picking up on the first wide line on the bottom of the daf at the two dots. Hayabatel min asela. Lo yomar lo tein li sela eleno sin lo scharo kipoel batel. So it says, if you remember again. So the Mishnah said again, I'm walking down the street, I go ahead and I find the Metzia, I find that a lost object. So again, I don't have the right to say, listen, Reuven, I found your object, I returned it to you. I would have made, $150 during that time. So therefore, again, you owe me $150. You can't do that. But again, I'm about to say, that being said, I am compensated, kipal batal. In other words, I'm about to say, there is this concept that because I am engaged in returning Reuven's lost object, therefore, halacha l'maisa, I do lose money. As a result of that, therefore, again, I am entitled to some level of compensation. So the Gemara says, what do I get? So kipal batal. So the Gemara says as follows: No sin lo scharo kipal batal. My kipal batal. What does that mean? Both say kipal batal literally means like an idle worker. So what does it mean I get like an idle worker? I'm Rabbi kipal batal shel osa malacha de batal mina. So Rabbi says, this is interesting. So what they do essentially is like this. Let's say for argument's sake, I'm a farmer. So I will say, so obviously I earn X amount of money as being a farmer. So the question is like this: how much money, how much less would I be willing to accept in order to do a much easier job, or in order not to work for today? In other words, I make X amount of dollars working. How much money would I accept not working today? Or how much money would I accept doing a job that has much less exertion? That's the amount, ultimately, again, that I get paid for returning a lost object. Rashi says over here, Kipal batal sha'oso malacha de batal minei, kama adam rotza litol, ve'livchos mischaro, libatal mimalacha zu kaveda. So assuming that, let's say, I have a job that requires an incredible amount of exertion. Every job requires exertion. So how much money would I be willing to accept to do a job that has less exertion? Shu'osik ba, ve'lasok b'malacha kala kizu, so again, we look at what I do for a living, and again, how much money would I be willing to accept to go ahead and do a job that had less exertion? So that's the amount of money that I'm entitled to recapture for returning the lost object. Now, obviously, we'll say this is going to be subjective because it all depends on the person. It all depends on what he does for a living. But again, to be clear, you don't get compensated at the salary level that you're at. In other words, so I make X amount of money. Now it took me an hour to go ahead and deal with this lost object, so I recapture 1 hour of lost salary. That's not what happens. You recapture something, but essentially, again, it's the amount that I would have taken to do a job of lesser exertion. Okay? Remember again, if there is a beis din that's present, so I can say to the beis din, listen, I'm willing to return Reuven's lost object, but I make a lot of money. So therefore, again, I want to make sure that I'm compensated at the level of my salary. So the Gemara says as follows. Isser v'Rav Safra avid iske v'hadi adavi. What's the interesting case over here? Isser and Rav Safra, they entered into a business dealing with each other. Azr Rav Safra, palig lebelo daite di Isser. We'll say, I just want to point out something absolutely amazing. Just as a Moshe skill and everything. So we'll say, Isser and Rav Safra, these are two Talmidei Chachamim. And I will say, what do you see? What are they doing? What are they doing? They're engaged in business. I will say, I want to be clear. Having a successful career and being a Talmid Chacham are not contradictory to each other. There is now, again, it's always easier in life to live in extremes, right? Always easy in life to say, either I'm doing this or I'm doing this. Of course, that's the easiest approach, right? I'm going to be a captain of commerce and an Amma Oretz. Or I'm going to be a great Talmid Chacham and not earn a living. Of course, you could always choose an either or. But just to point out, when the Gemara tells us these stories, that's because it's telling us that a synthesis is possible. A synthesis is difficult, right? To be able to go ahead and blend a life of material success with spiritual success is incredibly complicated. But it's absolutely and unequivocally possible. So the Gemara goes right there. So what happened? Azra Rav Safra palig below daite the Isser. Rav Safra is interesting. Rav Safra decided, you know what, I'm done. Right, I'm done. I want to get out of this partnership. See, he divided the partnership assets without Isser present. But he did it ba'ape betray. Obviously, again, Rav Safra wasn't going to do this by himself and alone, because that would be inappropriate. So what did he do? He got two witnesses. And he divided up the partnership property in the presence of two witnesses. Rashi says over here, palag bischora v'lo hayu maos eladari hatzar shuma. So both say, so just to point out, Rashi points out over here, it's not the pshat that there was like a partnership bank account. You know, $100,000 in the partnership bank account. Isser gets 50,000 and Rav Safra gets 50. That would have been easy. The issue over here is that there was merchandise. So obviously, merchandise requires a valuation. And because it requires evaluation, he did it in the presence of two witnesses. Also, so they came before Rabbi Barafuna. Amrale zil aisi tlasa de palgas kamayu. So again, they brought this case. So obviously, Isser wasn't happy about this. So they brought this before Rabbi, and Rabbi says to Rav Safra, okay, no problem. Go ahead and bring the beis din. Asi tlasa de palgas kamayu. Bring the beis din that you did the property distribution, the property division in front of them. Inam, the other possibility was at top of Lamed days, Trey migot lasa, or at least bring two out of the three. Binami Trey sahadi de palgas ba'ape beit lasa, or at least bring two witnesses that you divided the partnership assets in front of a beis din of three. Amrle minalacha. So obviously Rav Safra didn't do this, right? Rav Safra didn't divide up the property assets in front of a beis din. He did in front of two witnesses. So obviously Rabba's coming along and saying you could only do a division like this in the presence of a beis din. So Rav Safra says to Rabba, where do you get this from? In other words, why are you assuming that property division from a partnership has to be done in the presence of a beis din? So Amrle disnan im yesh sham beis din masna b'fneihem. In Sham Bezdin mi yisna shalo kodem. So both say, so remember, because so Rabbi responded, comes from our Mishnah. What does our Mishnah say? That if I want to be able to recapture lost wages as a result of returning a lost property, I need to make that stipulation in front of Beis Din. And if there is no Beis Din there, then I have every right not to engage in the lost property and focus on my own parnasa. What do you see from here? Whenever you're going to be extracting money in some way, you got to do it in front of a beis din. So therefore, Rabbi is saying to Rav Safra, you want to divide up partnership assets, that's fine, but Lamaisa, you have to do that in front of a beis din. Amar le'mi dami. So Rav Safra said, come on, that's not a good comparison. Hasam demafik mamona meha umosiv lahai ba'ina beis din. Aval hacha didi shakli gilui milsa ba'almahu b'trei sagile. So we'll say, listen to this. So Rav Safra responded, it's not a fair comparison. But in the case of the Mishnah, the reason why you need a beis din is why? Because I, the finder, am going to try to extract money from the owner of the object. So if you're going to try to extract money, then Lamaisa, you need a beis din. division of partnership, part will say, is not extracting money. What is division of property of a partner? What is the division of partnership? What is the division of assets in a partnership? So the Gemara calls Gilui Milsa. Gilui Milsa literally translates as clarification of facts. In other words, I get 50%, he gets, right? So Rav Safra says, I get 50%, and ultimately Isra gets 50%. I just want to go ahead and do the division in the presence of witnesses so that it's clear who's getting what. But there's nothing in doubt over here. So it's an interesting distinction. So just to point out, so what Rav Safra is positing is, when do you need a Beis Din? Beis Din is necessary when you're trying to extract money. But if all I'm trying to do is to clarify just who gets what, but again, the pot is understood, and the nature of the division of the pot is understood. We just have to decide what's going to go here, what's going to go there. Perhaps that doesn't, not perhaps. So Rav Safra is positing that does not require a Beis Din, that only requires edus, testimony. So the Gemara says, Teidaf, I'll prove this not interesting case. I will say, Amana mocher shelo b'fnei Beis Din. So I will say, Amana, a widow who is being sustained from the estate of the Yisomim, right? So Reuven is married to Rachel. Reuven dies. Rachel is entitled to material support, right? To zonos from the estate. So now an Amana has the ability to go ahead and sell off property for her own support, even not in the presence of Beis Din. So we'll say again. Now, what's his proof with that? So we'll say. So the idea over here, as Rashi points out, the only thing is she does need two witnesses. She needs to sell the property in the presence of witnesses. Why? In order to make sure that she's not underselling the property. That's the issue over here. So we'll say. So interestingly enough, what do you see from here? What you see from here is that halacha l'maisa, when it's already clear that you're entitled to something, you don't need a Beis Din in order to be involved. You just need edus to make sure that there's clarity on the facts. Abaye said, "V'lav mi itmar Allah." Rabbi Yosef, Yomi, Rabbi Nachman, Amana eina tzricha Beis Din shel mumchin, aval tzricha Beis Din shel adyotos. So we'll say the Gemara says over here. The Gemara says, Rabbi Yosef, Yomi says, or I should say, Abaye said to him, "You're not quoting the whole halacha. At the end of the day, we'll say, even by the property of the Amana, halacha l'maisa, you're going to go ahead and need a Beis Din." Now, granted, you need an expert Beis Din, but you absolutely need a Beis Din. So we'll say, so the way it turns out over here is that something from the conclusion of the Gemara, that Lamaisa, Rav Safra did the wrong thing. That Rav Safra as much as Rav Safra's intentions were good, right, just to divide up property, assets of the partnership, Lamaisa, even that type of division really should be done in front of a Beis Din. So if I will say, come full circle, it's pretty much whenever you're dealing, now obviously, if you have two parties and the parties are working together and they just want edus, they just want witnesses to the transaction, so of course you don't need a Beis Din. But wherever you're getting into a situation where all of the parties are not necessarily around the table together, you're going to want the Beis Din ultimately again to oversee this transaction. Okay, incredible. Mishnah. Let's say here we go. Matzah berefes ein chayiv ba. It's an interesting case. If you find an animal in a refes is a barn. Refes is a barn. You find an animal in a barn, it's not lost. Now, we'll have to, it's kind of like saying, if I find your wallet in your pocket, there's no mitzvah hashava saveda. Oh, look what I found, right? So again, we'll clarify the scope of this a little bit, but bepashtos, if you find an animal in the barn, in chayiba means you're not chayiv to return it, because it doesn't have the status of being lost. You find an animal in public domain, ultimately, again, you are chayiv to go ahead and return it. Now, we actually referenced a number of these cases yesterday. If I'm a Kohen and I'm walking by and I see a lost object in a cemetery, what's the halacha? Lo yitamela. So we'll say, I as a Kohen do not make myself tameh in order to return the lost object. Im amar lo aviv hitameh. We'll say, let's say again, my father tells me, so I'm a Kohen, and my father orders me, go into the cemetery and retrieve the lost object. Osha amar lo al tachzir. Or I find the lost object and my father tells me not to return it. What's talacha? Lo yishmalo. I do not listen to my father in these circumstances. Again, we'll define the scope of this as well. Parak v'tan, afilu arba v'chamisha pamim chayiv. So we'll say, remember again, we were introduced yesterday in yesterday's Gemara to the mitzvahs of prika and te'ina. Prika means I see my friend's animal struggling under its load. There's an obligation to help unload the animal. That's prika. Ti'ina is the obligation to help the owner reload his animal. So I will say, so just like we saw in yesterday's daf, that even if Reuven loses his same object 4 or 5 times, 10 times, 20 times, I'm obligated in Hashavas Aveda every single time. So too by prika and ti'ina, I'm obligated to help out as many times as I can. So the Gemara says, sheleima azov ta'azov. That was the double lashon, azov ta'azov. Help out as many times as you need to. Halach v'yashav lo va'amar ha'ol va'alecha mitzvah im ritzoncha lifrok prok. Suppose now listen to this. What happens in the following situation? What happens if I say, now watch this. So Reuven's animal is struggling underneath its load. I see this, right? I see this. I walk over. Reuven says, I'm so happy you're here. I'm just going to sit over here. I'm going to order myself a margarita, right? I'll sit on the side over here, sit on the lounge chair, right? And tell me when you're finished. Just text me when you're done, right? After all, again, right? You have the mitzvah to help. So we'll say, in that case over here, what's the aliyah? So the Gemara says, pater. In that case, I am pater. Why am I pater? Shne'emar imo. I will say, the pasuk says, azov ta'azov imo. What's the mitzvah pre-kantina bosai? I'm obligated to help the owner of the animal unload or reload his animal. Which Rabbi means what? If the owner is participatory, then I'm obligated to help. If the owner is not participatory, then I'm not obligated. Bosai, what a tremendous Musar Haskell. What is it teaching me? He'll say, you can only help people if they're willing to help themselves. If a person is not willing to put in the work to better his situation, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says you can't help such an individual like that. I would say it's so incredibly amazing because this happens all the time, right? We have issues, and interestingly enough, so often we look to others to fix our issues. And I'm going to get a whole great team of people to fix what's broken in me. There's only one person noticeably absent from the team, and it's me. So the Torah says, azov ta'azov imo. If the owner is willing to put in the effort, then great, we can get this done. But if the owner is not willing to put in the effort, everyone else, it's just a bracha levatala. You're not going to do anything. You're not going to be able to help. Let's say, if I'm not willing to roll up my sleeves to help myself, then no matter how great the intervention team you have around you, it is not going to work. Incredible. Now what happens if the owner is willing to help, but what? He's very old, or he's very ill. So therefore, again, he can't help. Then Rabbi say, in that case, I'm chayiv. In that case, even though the owner can't participate, I'm still going to be chayiv. Mitzvah min haTorah lifrok, avalo liton. So this is actually interesting. We'll talk about this more in the Gemara. Midoraisa, there is a mitzvah to go and unload the animal, but there is no biblical mitzvah to reload the animal. Rabbi Shimon Omer af liton. Rabbi Shimon says, no, there's a biblical mitzvah to help reload as well. Rabbi Yosef Lili Omer, Emhaya alav yeser masui in zokoklo. But say, watch this. Rabbi Yosef Lili says, if the owner overloaded the animal, let's say he just put on a load that the animal is not capable of carrying, there is no mitzvah to help unload this animal. Why? Shene'emar tachas masa'o. The pasuk says, if you see the animal buckling underneath its burden, masui shiyachal lamavo. So masa'o, its burden means a burden that it is capable of shouldering. All right, so a lot to unpack over here. Let's go. So we'll say, let's go back. Let's start with the barn case. Remember again, what did we say about the barn? I walk into a barn. I see an animal there. I have no mitzvah shavas haveda. It's not lost. So okay, let's qualify this. Amar Rava, Refesh Amru Ina Mata Ve'ina Mishameres. So I'll say, obviously, Rava says we're talking about a barn over here. Then I will say, on one hand, Ina Mata means it's not fully open, that it encourages the animal to run away, but it's also not guarded. So I'll say, obviously, we're talking about a case here where I walk into a barn. I don't know whose barn this is, and I see like there's something interesting. On one hand, it's not a typical barn which guards the animal, but it's also not fully open. So I'll say, Eno mata, midiktani eno chayiba. So I'll say, on one hand, it doesn't encourage the animal to run away. That's why the Mishnah says I'm not obligated to return it. Ve'ena mishameres, but at the same time, it's not fully guarded. Midi itzrich lemisni eno chayiba. Obviously, once you're talking about a barn, that's not guarded also. Why? Because if it's a barn that's guarded, then what? Rabbi will say, what is that called? What is that called? Private property, right? And then Rabbi will say, don't go on it at all. So obviously we're talking about this strange dynamic where on one hand, the animal is in a barn, right? And it's not like everything is wide open. So it could be that there's intentional placement over here and that this belongs to someone. On the other hand, it doesn't look, it's clearly not as secure as a typical barn would be. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry, because we'll say we're talking about a barn that's totally secure. So also it's obviously in general, if you find an animal on the outside, the goal is to return it to the inside. If you find it inside the barn, should there be any mitzvah? So we'll say that's the interesting case of the barn of the Mishnah. So what you begin to see over here is I stumble upon an animal in a barn. The barn on one hand is not fully open, so it's not encouraging the animal to run away, but it's also not really secure as a barn should be. So we'll say, so what's the halacha in this case? Don't touch it. Leave it alone. Since it is inside a structure, and again, although it is not fully secure, it's semi-secure, it's not totally open, leave it alone and walk away. Okay, next. Matzah b'refes yenu chayv. Rabbi Yitzchak, v'hu shomed zechus l'tchum. And we'll say, so what's the next? So Rabbi Yitzchak says, when we talk about, again, in this case of the barn, we're talking about a barn outside of the tchum. So the Gemara says, Michlal d'b'reshus harabim afilu b'socha tchum nami chayv. You can infer from that if you find an animal in the public thoroughfare, even if it's within the tchum, you would be chayiv. Ike demasni la seifa. Others explain this in the seifa. B'reshus harabim chayiv ba. If you find the animal in reshus harabim, you're absolutely chayiv. Am Rabbi Yitzchak, v'hu she'omed zechus l'tchum. This is assuming that it's outside of the tchum. Michlal d'berefes afilu omed zechus l'tchum nami eino. But you can infer from this. So we'll say that with the barn, even if the barn is outside of the tchum, we'll say again the type of barn that we're talking about, where it's not fully open, but it's not also totally secure, leave it alone. Okay, weiter. So since now we come to this very interesting sugya. I'm walking I'm a Kohen. I'm walking down the street. I see that there's a lost object in a cemetery. The halacha is I don't go in. I don't go in. So we'll say, now remember again, then the Mishnah brought up the case of what? My father tells me to go in. My father tells me to go ahead and go into the cemetery and go retrieve the lost object. Or for that matter, I found the lost object and my father tells me don't return it, keep it. I don't listen to my father. So the Gemara says, how do I know that if I'm a Kohen, my father tells me, go into the cemetery and become Tameh, or don't return the lost object, that I don't listen to my father? Shneimar ish imo va'aviv tiro, v'eshab sosai tishmoru ani Hashem. I will say the pasuk says, a man should fear his mother and father, but also keep my statutes. I am God. Kulchem chayavin bichvodi. So we'll say, so it's interesting. What do you see from here? It juxtaposes the mitzvah to fear or revere one's parents with the mitzvah of keeping the statutes of Hashem. So why the juxtaposition? To say that as much as you are obligated to fear, to revere, to honor, to listen to your parents, both you and your parents are obligated in the fear, reverence, and obedience to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore, when there is a clash between those two, between honor to parents and ultimately honor to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, honor to the Ribono Shel Olam always wins. Therefore, if my parent tells me to do something that is contrary to the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I do not have an obligation to listen to my parents. Incredible. So the Gemara says, "Time because of Rachman Hashem society Shmoru." And here's what's interesting: the reason for this is because the pasuk says, "Keep my statutes." Ha lav hachi hava aminat saisale. We'll say it's interesting. It sounds like that. Like without this juxtaposition, you might have thought that you would be obligated to listen to your parents, even if their will contradicts the divine will. Va'amai, but why is that? Hayaseh v'haylo saseh v'aseh. Now listen, here's what's interesting. Let's take the case ultimately of where my father tells me to keep a found out. I find something. My father says, don't do Hashavas Hadeidah, just keep it. Now listen, here's what's interesting. Why would I even think that I listen to my father? After all, honoring parents is a positive commandment. And not returning a lost object, or returning a lost object, is an asay and a lo sasay, positive commandment and a prohibition. V'lo asay asay v'dachis lo sasay v'asay. And I will say, so why would I think that the positive commandment of honoring parents would set aside the positive commandment and prohibition of returning a lost object? So I would have thought like this. In general, honor of parents is compared to honor of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It says, honor your father and mother. And the pasuk says, literally, honor HaKadosh Baruch Hu from your glory. From your glory. But say, by the way, just what that pasuk means, kabed es Hashem mehoncha. Hon actually really means like your wealth. What it means, I will say, is, the way this pasuk is understood in Mishlei, is the Ribono Shel Olam gives each and every one of us talents and abilities. There's an obligation to use your God-given talents and abilities, ultimately, again, for the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's why I will say is incredibly important. If you have a particular koach, you have a particular talent, a particular bracha, and you are called upon to use that to honor HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you don't have the right to refuse. I will say, I say this all the time, like the Balei Tefillah. Right? People have the ability to really daven and inspire. And sometimes you ask them to daven, they'll be like, no. So I say, it's okay. Leaving aside, understand the halacha that says first. You say no, then you say, okay, leaving that aside. I'll say it's important. If you have a talent, it's not your right to decide whether or not to use it in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's the same way. If a person is blessed with wealth, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is giving you that as a custodian for his money. So it's not up to you to decide. And by the way, when I say wealth, I don't mean wealth meaning like a person is crazy wealthy. I mean a person has the ability to give tzedakah. It's not up to you to decide I want to give or I don't want to give. It's up to you to decide where you want to give it, absolutely. But I will say if you have that, that's not yours. That's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave you. So same with the Baal Tefillah, who has the beautiful voice, doesn't have the right to say, no, I don't feel like it today. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave you that gift, then you have to utilize it. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave you wealth, you have to utilize it. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave you empathy, you have to utilize it. Whatever your particular gift is, that's what you have to use in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Such a different way to look at things. So often in life, we look at our gifts and our abilities as our own. My money is mine, my good voice is mine, my empathy is mine, my compassion is mine. It's not. It's not. Whatever unique qualities you have, those were given to you by the Ribono Shel Olam in order to accomplish great things. And not using them as such is either one of two things. Either it's gezel, either it's theft from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or it might be me'ilah. Right? What's me'ilah? Me'ilah is taking something consecrated and using it for mundane things. If you take your gifts and you just use them for you, that's me'ilah. That's me'ilah. Sefer Rabbi says, see that the Torah uses, well, it's not Torah, Tanakh uses the same lashon. Kabed es avicha ve'asimecha and kabed es Hashem mehoncha. Same word of kabed. So therefore, again, I would have thought, the Gemara says, Hilchach l'sayisla. So I'll say, I would have thought that therefore, maybe, even when my parents tell me to do something contrary to biblical law, maybe I should do it. Because honor of parents is on such a level, that literally, again, it's equated ultimately, again, with honoring of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So therefore, again, kamash malon tilo l'shamala. So I'll say that's why the Esmin Society Shmoru says no. On one hand, yes, but no. Yes, honoring your parents is an amazing and overwhelming mitzvah, right? And I will say, but again, at the same time, if it contradicts honoring the Ribono Shel Olam, then obviously Kavod of Hashem goes ahead and trumps everything. But I'll just mention something interesting, just quickly. I will say, a lot of times when it comes to Kibbud Avayim, so sometimes we learn these sugyas, so those who don't have parents sometimes feel like a little bit of like an ache. You know, we're learning the beauty of this mitzvah, but maybe a person doesn't have parents in this world. So like, what do you do with this? So I want to tell you something very important. The pasuk in Megillas Esther, because it's still Purim. Still Purim, right? It's Adar. As you know, we forget about this, by the way. Mishenichnas Adar Marbin Besimcha. People only apply this to the part of the month that precedes Purim. But remember, again, it's a din in all of Purim. So therefore, we're still in the era of Purim itself. So we'll say, so the pasuk by Megillas Esther says as follows: It says, Vayhi omen es Hadassah. Talk about Mordechai and Esther in the beginning of the Megillah. Vayhi omen es Hadassah, ki ein la avvaim, ubemos avi ima lakachala Mordechai labas. So we'll say, so omen es Hadassah means she was an orphan, and he raised her. And then the pasuk says, ki ein la avvaim, that ultimately, again, that she didn't have a mother and father. So we'll say it's redundant. Obviously, if she's an orphan, she doesn't have a mother and father. So Saul brought down an incredible idea. What Haman was Amalek. What's the koach of Amalek? What's the koach of Amalek? Koach of Amalek stems from Esav, specifically kibud av va'el. The whole koach of Amalek, I will say, Amalek has one mitzvah under its belt, and that was honoring parents that came from its ancestor Esav. Esav is the Zayda of Amalek, and Esav was a Metsuyan. He was an expert in one thing. He was a Rasha Merusha in everything else. But he had his thing. It was Kibbut Ava'im. No one did Kibbut Ava'im like Esav. That's the Koach of Amalek. So brought down, no one was able to ever combat that mitzvah of Kibbut Ava'im. There was never, it's incredible to think that there was never a Yid, right? There was never someone in Klal Yisrael who was able to really combat that zechus. So we'll say why? Because when you have parents, we know Kibbut Ava'im was really difficult, and especially as parents get older, it becomes even more difficult. It's overwhelming. So we'll say, listen to this. There is a mitzvah of Kibbut Ava'im, however, that's perfect, which is when a person no longer has parents in this world, but they think about how much they wish they could be mechabe their parents. So I can't do anything for my parents because they're not here in this world. But what I would do if my mother was here, what I would do if my father was here, and that yearning to perform the mitzvah is so pure. It's pure. It's the holiest of the holiest. Esther Hamalka had that. She had that yearning. She had that pining to perform the mitzvah of Kibbut Ava'im, and that yearning was so pure that it was she who was able to offset the zechus of Amalek and ultimately, again, the zechus of Haman. That's why the Megillah is redundant. The first time it says, Omen es Hadassah, tells us she was an orphan. But the Megillah is foreshadowing. Do you want to know why this young woman had the ability to bring down Haman? Ki ein la av va'im. Because every single day she thought about what I would do if my parents were in this world. How much I would be mechabe them. What I wouldn't give just to serve them a little bit more. All those things I took for granted while my parents were in this world. What I wouldn't give to be able to have that zechus, that yearning, that pining to perform the mitzvah of Kibbut Ava'im, that's what gave her the ability to overcome Amalek. So as I said, just want to point out that even if a person is not zocheh to have living parents in this world, it doesn't mean you can't do Kibbut Ava'im. Besides the fact that everything that a child does to provide an aliyah for the neshama of a beloved parent is Kibbut Ava'im. That's Kibbut Ava'im. But sometimes just thinking about how I wish I could do for my parents, how I wish if my parent were still in this world, what I would do for them, that's the mitzvah of Kibbut Ava'im as well. So when we learn these sugyas, if you are one of those people who's not zocheh to have a parent or parents in this world, don't feel like you're missing out. Because again, the ache and the yearn to do for the parent could be just as powerful, maybe even more powerful than the actual mitzvah itself. Incredible. All right, let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, Metzia ben Torah lifrok avalo liton. So we'll say, so again, so there's a mitzvah in the Torah to go. So we'll say, so the Tanakama said that there's a mitzvah to go ahead and unload the animal, but not a mitzvah to load the animal. So the Gemara says, Maia Hoffman, liton. What does that mean? The Gemara says, Ilana liton klal. We'll say, second wide line. If you say that, what it means is that literally there is no mitzvah to load the animal. So Ma'ishna prika dichsiv azov tazov imo tinanami haksiv hakim takim. They'll say it's not true. It's a pasuk. Right? Azov tazov refers to unloading the animal. Hakim takim, literally lift it up, refers to reloading the animal. So how can you say that te'ina, reloading the animal, is not a biblical mitzvah? Ella mitzvah min haTorah lifrok bechinam velo liton bechinam ella b'schar. Interesting. Tanakama says, I have an obligation to help unload the animal for free, But if I help the owner reload the animal, I have the right to ask for compensation. Rabbi Shimon says, Rabbi Shimon disagrees Tanakama, and Rabbi Shimon says, no, even reloading the animal has to be done for free. So the Gemara says, let's analyze this. Bryce says you have to help unload the animal for free, but reloading you could charge. Rabbi Shimon says, no, you could, both of them have to be done for free. So what's going on over here? My tamayu. So we'll say, my tamayu d'Rabbanan. So we'll say, what? Now remember, the Rabbanan say that halacha l'maisa, loading the animal for free, reloading you could ask for payment. So what's the logic? These are the Rabbi Shimon, because if Rabbi Shimon was correct, that both have to be done for free. So lichtov rachmana ti'ina v'lo bai prika. So Rabbi said then the Torah should have just written reloading, and I would have automatically known unloading. How so? Va'anamina umatin and the less beit tsar balei chayim v'lekach and kiss. Rabbi say when it comes to reloading, there's no tsar balei chayim, right? There's no pain to the animal. Why? Because the animal doesn't have anything on it. There's also no loss. Now the logic of saying there's no loss is because, again, the animal's not about to buckle under its load. So there's no loss. And yet, Hy'd, if you're going to tell me that you're Hy'd to do that for free, okay, then Prika, then unloading the animal, the space tsar b'alei chayim b'chisaron kis, l'kol shekain. So Rabbi said, in all Prika, where there is, number one, pain to the animal, number two, there's a chance of real loss. So we'll say, if you have to do ti'ina, you certainly have to do Prika. So we'll say, if that's the case, why did the Torah write both Prika and Tina? Prika b'chinam, Tina b'schar. To teach me, I will say that what? Prika, unloading has to be done for free, but Tina, reloading, which doesn't have tsar b'alei chayim and doesn't have a loss, you're obligated to help, but you are entitled to compensation. That's the Rabbanan, I will say. So according to the Rabbanan, unloading for free, reloading for schar. Rabbi Shimon, my timer. What's Rabbi Shimon's logic? Let's remember again. Rabbi Shimon says both Prika and Ti'ina for free. Mishum delo mesaimi cry. So Rabbi said this is interesting. So Rabbi Shimon says like this. Rabbi Shimon says, I will say the lashonos of the psukim of Hakim, Takim, Azov, Tazov. I will say it's not clear which is talking about what. So therefore, we'll talk about this more. So therefore, again, had the Torah just said one of them, I would have thought ultimately again that there's only a mitzvah of Prika, and there's not a mitzvah of Ti'ina at all. So the Torah has to write both of them, I will say, because there's a little bit of textual ambiguity as to which one is talking about which. So therefore, I need both to indicate to me that they're both a mitzvah. But ultimately, again, but they both have to be done for free. Okay, for Rabbanon, Amai lo masami cry. The Rabbanon will say, what are they talking about? Why? I don't understand why. What do you mean that there's textual ambiguity? Hacha ksiv rovetz tachas masa'o. I will say one pasuk said, the pasuk of Azov Tazov says the animal is buckling underneath its burden. Hasam ksiv noflim baderech. Deramu inu utunai ba'arach ayu mashma. Which means what? So ultimately, again, that the animal is sitting there and its load is right next to it. I will say, so there's no textual ambiguity. It's clear. One is talking about the animal buckling underneath its load. One is talking about where the animal is there and its stuff is right next to it. That's Ti'ina. Rabbi Shimon, no flim baderech inu v'tioninu alayu mashma. Rabbi Shimon says no flim baderech could also mean that what? That Allah l'maisa, the animal is standing there underneath its load. Okay, so we'll say some machlokes. Amar Rava says Amar Beis midivrei shneim nilma. So we'll say so here's what we have. I just want to point out the fundamental machlokes over here. Fundamental machlokes. We'll say everyone is agreeing. I just want to point out everyone is agreeing that midaraisa there are two mitzvos. Prika, which means I go ahead and I see an animal buckling underneath its load. What's the halacha? Azov Tazov. You have to help. That's mitzvah number one. Mitzvah number two, Ti'ina. Animal is sitting there with its load by the side. I have an obligation to help the owner go ahead and reload his animal. Hakim, Takim. Both Daraisa. What's the machlokes? Rabbanan say, Prika you have to do for free. Ti'ina, you have the right to charge. What's the second opinion? Rabbi Shimon says both bechinam, both for free. Now watch this. Comes along Rava. Rava says, by the way, leaving that machlokes aside, you see something very interesting. The divrei shneim, Rava said, Lama Beis, 32b. Midivrei shneim nilmad, sar balei chayim de'oraisa. I will say, you see from here, but I will say, just before we go on, I just realized that that's the Leif Tayin. So I will say, the Leif Tayin that we just saw before was the mitzvah of kibbut aveim, the ability to do it in your heart. Right? That's the Leif Tayin to the daf. I will say that we see the concept that there is ultimately, again, the ability, sometimes mitzvahs you can't perform with your hands, you absolutely do have the ability to do in your heart, to do in your machshava. And those mitzvahs, I will say, sometimes are so much more powerful because they're complete and they're perfect. The Leah Sol Metzia teaches us ultimately the power of performing mitzvahs b'lei b'ezot. Okay, back to Gemara. For will say from both of these opinions, both the Rabban and Rabbi Shimon, what do you learn? Sar balechayim d'oraisa. They will say this is going to actually be a really interesting sugya. What you see from both of these opinions, will say, is they both hold that causing pain to animals is an isur d'oraisa. Now we'll say, now we're not talking about like causing pain to animals, but rather what we're talking about over here is what? Alleviating pain, right? That ultimately, again, alleviating pain to animals, ultimately, again, is a chiyuv d'oraisa. Chiyuv d'oraisa. So the Gemara says, "Va'afilu Rabbi Shimon lo ka'amar elam mishum d'lo masami krai." Even Rabbi Shimon's, right? Even Rabbi Shimon, his opinion that you have to do both for free, ultimately is because the psukim are ambiguous. Aval Masai Mikrai, Darshin and Kavachomer. But ultimately, again, I will say, if the psukim were more explicit, we'd be able to darshin the Kavachomer of the Rabbanon, Mishum Mai, Lad Mishum Tzarba Lechayim Darshinon. Good. The Gemara said, Dilma Mishum the Igon Chisar and Kiss. We'll say maybe not. Maybe the obligation to help is because there's a loss. There's a financial loss. Vachi Kamar, this is what it means to say. Umatina the last Bechisar and Kiss Chayiv. So we'll say Tina, which doesn't have a loss. And we'll say, just to understand, why doesn't Ti'ina have a loss? Because we'll say, again, the animal's not buckling underneath its load. And whatever, the owner will get someone else to help. So the Gemara says, Prika and Chayiv, yet you're obligated to help. Prika de ispe chisarankis. Lakosha came. So we'll say, Prika, where there is chisarankis, I'm certainly obligated to help. But maybe it has nothing to do with Sarba Lechayim. The Gemara says, one second. Ute'ina in bachisarankis. How can you say that the obligation to reload the animal doesn't have a potential loss for the owner? After all, Milo Askinan, Da'adahachi Bahachi, Batal, Mishuke. We'll say, of course there's a loss, right? If Reuven has his animal, and the animal was unloaded, so the donkey's sitting there, and the merchandise is sitting right next to it, and I don't help, of course there's a loss. And we'll say, Bepashtos, let's say Reuven's on the way where? To the market, right? He's there, he's on the way to sell his merchandise. If I don't help him reload, there's absolutely a financial loss. Inam, the other possibility is, Asu Ganavi Vishakli. Kol Madi Kabade. What's saying? Leaving a donkey with merchandise sitting by its side also opens Reuven up to what? What? To theft. To theft. So of course there's a loss. To which the Gemara says, Teida, Kamash Idigade. Teida says, Sar Balechayim Darais. So we'll say, Rabbi, you have to say, everyone agrees, Sar Balechayim. Causing pain to animals, or I will say, on the flip side, the obligation to alleviate pain and suffering of animals is a mitzvah da'oraisa. Diktani say, Rabbi Yosef Lili Omer, Im haya alav yeser masa'o ein zakok lo. We'll say, listen to this. Well, what did Rabbi Yosef Lili say? It's actually very interesting halacha. Rabbi Yosef Lili said at the end of the Mishnah that if I'm walking by, I see Reuven's animal, and Reuven's animal is buckling underneath its load, and it's clear to me that amount of stuff should have never been loaded onto the animal in the first place. In other words, the animal is not capable of holding that. Rabbi Yosef literally said, "In zakuk lo," I'm not obligated to help. Why? Because the pasuk shnemar tachas masao will say. So Rabbi Yosef literally is like this: I see the animal buckling underneath its load. What does its load mean? Masuin sheyachol la'amod bo, a load that it is capable of shouldering. So both say, so therefore again, that's Rabbi Yossi. Mechlal the Tanakama savar zokoklo. And both say, what do you see from here? It's only Rabbi Yossi Galili who holds like this. The Tanakama rejects this. The Tanakama says, no. Whenever you see an animal buckling underneath its load, whether it really was a proper load, wasn't a proper load, I am obligated to go ahead and intervene and help out. Why? My taima lav mishum the tsar balechayim d'oraisa. Because the Tanakama holds Sar Balechayim is Doraisa. Okay, you're right. Reuven should have never piled such a load on top of his animal. Inachinami, you're right. But Lamaisa, he did. Sar Balechayim is Doraisa, and therefore I'm obligated to intervene. The Gemara says, Dilma, Besachas Masa'o Pligi. We'll say maybe they're arguing in the drasha of the pasuk. The Rabbi Yossi suffered darshin tachas masoi shiach lamabo, but Rabbanan sabri lo darshin tachas maso. Let's say, I don't know, maybe it's not a machlokes in Tzara L'chaim, maybe it's just a machlokes how to darshan the pasuk. The Gemara says no. Teida the Tzara L'chaim daraisa. No, I'm going to tell you once again, Tzara L'chaim is absolutely daraisa. Diktani Reisha, because we also remember again, what do we see in the Reisha? Halach b'yashav lo v'amar lo hol v'alach ha-mitzvah lifrok prok. So just remember we had this case, I'm walking by, I see Reuven's animal buckling underneath its load. So I run in to jump in to help, right? Mitzvah of priga. Reuven sees me, he says, oh, I'm so happy you're here, I'm just going to sit over there in the shade for a little bit, just text me when you're done. So I'll say, what did the Mishnah say? Pater, I don't have an obligation to help. Why? Shenemar imo. Because also remember again, the pasuk says imo. I'm sorry. We'll say this version is I'm sorry. Let me go back. I read this wrong. Teida the tsar b'alechayim lav doraisa. Right? Well, something more is switching gears. Meir says, you know what? You're right. Maybe tsar b'alechayim is not doraisa. Not doraisa. What's the proof that it's not doraisa? I'm walking by. I see Reuven's donkey buckling underneath its load. I go over to help. Reuven says, so happy you're here. I'm going to go sit down and catch up on a little bit of rest. Text me when you're finished. What's the halacha? I'm pater. Why? Because also the pasuk of Prika says, imo. I'm obligated to help the owner. If the owner is absolving or absenting himself from the process, I am not obligated to get involved. Now, it says in Gemara, if you really think that Tzar B'Alechem is D'Oraisa, Mali isi l'marei ba'adei, Mali l'asei marei la'adei. So I'll say, so again, if Tzar B'Alechem is D'Oraisa, I'll say, then what? Who cares? In other words, got it. Reuven is not a good guy if he's absenting himself from the process, but it's not about Reuven. It's not about Reuven. What is it about? The animal. So in other words, the fact that Reuven is absenting himself, why does that absolve me of relieving the suffering from the animal? Shabbos said that would seem to paint the picture that says Tsar B'Alechayim is not D'Oraisa. To which the Gemara said, the Olam Tsar B'Alechayim D'Oraisa. You know, the Gemara says no. Tsar B'Alechayim is D'Oraisa. Misab is pater legamre. So we'll say, what do you think pater means? You think pater means pater legamre? Pater doesn't mean pater, totally pater. The dilma pater bechinam b'chayiv b'schar. Oh. We'll say, so no. If you see the animal struggling, Tsar B'Alechayim is D'Oraisa, you have an obligation to intervene. So, but it says pater. What does pater mean? Pater means I have to do it, but what? I don't have to do it for free. I can charge. Meaning, this is what the Torah means to say. Ki isi lemarei ba'adei oved gabei bechinam. V'chilesi lemarei ba'adei oved gabei b'schar. Or the olam Tsar B'Alechayim D'Oraisa. So Rabbi said, listen to this. Maybe the halacha is like this. When I walk by and I see Reuven's animal buckling underneath its load, I have an obligation to help. So when the owner is also helping, then I have an obligation to help for free. But when the owner is not helping, I have an obligation to help. But what? I can charge. But there is always an obligation to assist the animal. Why? Because Tsar B'Alechayim is D'Oraisa. Tsar B'Alechayim is D'Oraisa. So the Gemara says, okay, let's analyze this. Lema Mesayele. So we'll say, let's bring a support to this. Here we go. Behemas ovi kochav metapal baki behemas Yisrael. So we'll say, if I see a struggling Gentile animal, now, let me say that differently. If I see the animal of a giant, right. If I see, right. So there's an akum who has an animal, and his animal is buckling underneath its load. So I will say, what's talacha? Metapa baki behemas Yisrael. I have an obligation to help in that situation the same way with a Jew who owns an animal. So the Gemara says, okay, let's analyze this. So both say that makes perfect sense. If I have an obligation to help the animal of a Gentile, the same way that I have an obligation to help an animal of a Jew, that's because Tsar B'Alechayim is D'Oraisa. Now let's say it has nothing to do with Jew versus non-Jew. It's an obligation to step in and alleviate suffering to animals. Therefore, that makes sense. So the Gemara says, maybe not. Hasam Vishum Eva. I will say, this might be something else. We have halachas like this, we have halachas like this, which are that there are certain halachas that technically only apply to Jews and not non-Jews. But because we live in a society where there are Jews and non-Jews, if you selectively apply certain acts of chesed to Jews and not Jews, then what? It creates animosity. creates animosity, creates a sense of animosity. So therefore I will say, maybe that's the halacha, because also what's going to happen, right? Maybe, Tzar Ba'alei Chaim is not daraisa, and therefore maybe it just applies to the animals of Jews. Those can you imagine what's going to happen? Imagine what's going to happen is you're walking down the road, you help the Jewish animal, you don't help the Gentile animal. That's just going to cause animosity in greater society. We can't do that. To which the Gemara says, how can I mistabra? This would seem to be clear. Diktani, listen to this. Im haisa tu'una yayin aser. I'm sorry. Im haisa tu'una yayin aser, ein zakokla. Let's say, watch this. If I walk by and I see the animal of a non-Jew, and it is carrying yayin nesach, right? It's carrying libational, right? Avodah zara wine. What's talacha? Ein zakokla. I am not obligated to help, even though it's buckling underneath its load. See, amit b'shlama lav d'oraisa, b'shulach ein zakokla. So I'll say, if you hold that Tzar Ba'alei Chaim is not d'oraisa, then it makes sense that I'm not obligated to help. Eli amrit d'oraisa, I'm my ein zakokla. But I will say, if I hold that Tzar Ba'alei Chaim is d'oraisa, then why would I not be obligated to help? In other words, who cares what the animal is carrying, right? In other words, we'll say, it's not a din whether it's carrying, whether it's carrying yayin esach, or it's carrying leftover chalent, right? What does it make a difference, right? Lamaisa, at the end of the day, if Tzar Ba'alei Chaim is d'oraisa, I have an obligation to help. So which the Gemara says, not necessarily. In other words, hakikam, this is what it means to say. Ulahatina yayin aser in zakukla. Oh, let's say something like this. Maybe he's talking about not prika, but rather what is it talking about? Ti'ina. And maybe what it's saying is like this, that halacha l'maisa, if let's say somebody unloaded the animal, and now I walk by and I see again, this animal now, again, there's a load of yayin nesach, so I'll say maybe I'm not obligated to help in the ti'ina, in the reloading of this animal. Prika, maybe yes, but ti'ina, no. Ti'ina, no. We'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up from Metzia. So we are leaving off ultimately again in the midst of this major machlokes of Tzar Ba'alei Chaim d'oraisa, Tzar Ba'alei Chaim d'Rabbanan. So we'll say, Meir Hashem, the resolution of that machlokes, Meir Hashem b'shah tova u'mitzlachas tomorrow. And we'll say, tremendous way to start the week. Shkoyach.